Imagine waking up in a city where a literal wall determines if you are heading to a capitalist cafe or a breadline. A world where a single hot mistake by a superpower could trigger a global nuclear winter. Today, we are closing out the AP European History curriculum by jumping from the radioactive tension of the Cold War straight into the palm of your hand, tracing the path from the Iron Curtain to the invention of the very smartphone that you are likely using to listen to this podcast episode right now. I'm Wendy with AP History Help, and this is Unit 9. It represents 10 to 15% of your exam, and it's the story of how Europe went from the brink of total annihilation to the economic miracle of the modern day. Stay tuned, because understanding how we got from duck and cover to click and scroll is the final piece of evidence you need to nail that 5 on your exam. April is the busiest and probably most stress-filled month of the AP student and teacher's year. We are finishing up content, hopefully, and turning toward exam prep. Students are looking for that magic bullet that will get them that 5 or 4 in some cases, or maybe they just want to pass. Whatever your focus is, your best bet is to set out a plan for studying and try to stick with it. Set up some review sessions with your friends, maybe a Heimler history watch party. Or an AP History Help watch party, better yet. I do have videos on YouTube. You know, I have made it super easy for you to find me. Everywhere you go, I am AP History Help. YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, all of the places. Just look up AP History Help. It's me. The only exception is that I do have a second YouTube channel that I use just for my shorts, and that's called AP History Help Shorts. Anyway, set up a schedule to have focused review with practice and feedback. And be sure to join me on April 26th on TikTok at 8:30 Eastern for a live stream review special. I will be there answering any questions that you have about the exam, about your courses, and that night I will edit it so it will post the very next day as the next episode of the podcast. Speaking of social media, I've posted my blind rankings of DBQ topics for World and APUSH, and be looking for Euro to come out very soon. Those get posted on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube Shorts. They're a lot of fun, and they get a lot of interaction, and I do base them on a little bit of research that I do to try to determine what I think is most likely going to be the topic of your DBQ. If you're not following me on your favorite social media platform, unless, of course, it's Twitter, because I'm not on there, please do be sure to do that. Episode of the AP History Help podcast. Well, we finally made it to the finish line of our AP European History content journey. Today we are tackling Unit 9, the Cold War and Contemporary Europe. This unit covers everything from the ashes of 1945 to the digital world that we live in today. And it's a heavy hitter, representing 10 to 15% of your exam. Now, if you're not in AP Euro, this topic can still be helpful since it correlates with AP World and APUSH Units 8. After World War II, or really as it was ending, we saw the beginning of some tensions between the US and the Soviet Union that laid the foundation for the Cold War. A good portion of this unit is about the development and the spreading of the Cold War as the rest of the world was pressured to choose a side. The other big topic is the 20th century changes and movements as nationalism shrinks in the rear view and globalization seems to be the attractive replacement. After World War II, Europe was devastated economically, physically, and psychologically. To keep nations from turning to communism, the US launched the Marshall Plan, providing over $12 billion in aid for reconstruction. This sparked an economic miracle in the West and fueled a new age of consumerism. Meanwhile, an ideological iron curtain descended across the continent. In the West, NATO was formed for the collective defense. World monetary systems like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, GATT, and even the WTO were all established. The East fell under Soviet domination through Comecon, which was Stalin's answer to the Marshall Plan. Now, let me point out, Stalin liked to do that. The West formed NATO, he formed the Warsaw Pact. The US introduced the Marshall Plan, he rolled out Comecon. Was it petty? Was it one-upmanship? Something like that. I mean, it definitely speaks to his lifetime of paranoid behavior, for sure. Now, while Europe didn't see a hot war on its own soil, the superpowers fought through proxy wars in the Korean War, Vietnam War, Yom Kippur War, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Even behind the Iron Curtain, the human spirit refused to be collectivized. They staged revolts and worked in solidarity or together to achieve their goals. People in the Soviet bloc constantly pushed back, most notably during the Hungarian Revolt in 1956 and Prague Spring in 1968. The Hungarian Revolt was a spontaneous national revolt sparked by the failures of Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies to meet economic goals and the continued suppression of individual rights. Although it significantly challenged the Soviet framework, it ended in a brutal reimposition of Soviet rule and the return of a repressive totalitarian regime. The Prague Spring was an attempt by Czechoslovakia to introduce limited reforms and loosen the grip of communist control. The movement was halted when Soviet leaders forced a hardline against the dissent, utilizing the Warsaw Pact defense alliance to maintain order and reimpose Soviet rule. While they failed to overthrow communism in the 50s and 60s, these events provided the historical context for the deep-seated tensions that eventually led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Speaking of which, let's talk about why and how the Cold War ended. After decades of duck and cover and high-stakes staring contests, the big red machine finally ran out of gas. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing a long period of economic stagnation. Their system was essentially stuck in the mud, and the new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, knew he had to try a Hail Mary pass to save it. He introduced two major reforms that you must know for the exam. Glasnost, which means openness. This was designed to make the Soviet system more flexible and transparent. For the first time, people could actually criticize the government without immediately disappearing. Perestroika, or restructuring. This was an attempt to modernize and restructure the stagnant Soviet economy. But here's the evidence, possibly complexity, for your essay. These reforms backfired. Instead of saving the system, they sparked a domino effect of freedom across Eastern Europe. In Poland in 1980, the Solidarity Labor Union challenged Soviet authority. By 1989, Poland held democratic elections, showing the world that Soviet supreme control was evaporating. The most iconic movement happened in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, signaling the impending end of the Soviet Union. By 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapsed and the Cold War was over. The map of Europe was instantly redrawn. Germany was reunited, the Czechs and the Slovaks parted ways peacefully, and Yugoslavia dissolved, though that one was far from peaceful. For your analysis, focus on the aftermath. The end of the Cold War led to the establishment of capitalist economies throughout Eastern Europe and allowed the European Union to enlarge by admitting former Eastern Bloc countries. The bipolar world was gone, replaced by the globalized, interconnected Europe we see today. If you get a short answer question on this, remember, Gorbachev didn't want the USSR to fall. He wanted to fix it. The historical situation was that his reforms unintentionally opened the floodgates for nationalism in satellite states, which proved to be a force the Soviet military could no longer suppress. Whew. All right, you ready? Time for our fun fact. I know you've been waiting for this. You may want to grab a refreshing soda for this one. You'll see why. This fun fact perfectly illustrates the ideological battle between democracy and communism. Intrigued? Keep listening. In 1959, at an American exhibition in Moscow, Vice President Richard Nixon gave Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev a sip of Pepsi. Khrushchev loved it. Fast forward to the 1980s. The Soviet Union wanted more Pepsi, but Soviet rubles were worthless in global markets. So how did they pay? They traded a fleet of 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer for a fresh shipment of soda. For a brief moment, Pepsi had the 6th largest navy in the world. Pepsi's CEO joked to the U.S. National Security Advisor, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you guys are." That, my friends, is the power of Western consumerism over a stagnant communist economy. While Europe was rebuilding, its old global empires were crumbling. Decolonization happened in waves, some peaceful, like in India, and some through brutal armed conflict, like the Viet Minh in Vietnam or the FLN in Algeria. Internal nationalism also turned violent. We saw the Basque separatist group, ETA, utilize nationalist rhetoric and violence in a failed attempt to establish an independent nation based on their unique culture and language. Meanwhile, the Flemish movement in Belgium represented a persistent separatist effort where regional and ethnic identities have challenged the established national and political order. Nationalist conflict plagued Ireland and Chechnya and reached a horrific peak with ethnic cleansing in the Balkans against Bosnian Muslims and Albanian Muslims of Kosovo in the early 1990s. Nationalistic rhetoric combined with arguments about ethnic rights led directly to war and genocide in the Balkan region. While Europe was busy rebuilding at home, its massive overseas empires were literally falling apart. This is decolonization. And for your exam, you need to know that it wasn't a single event. It was a messy, century-long process that varied from peaceful handovers to hot, bloody revolutions. It all started back in Unit 7 with Woodrow Wilson's idea of national self-determination, which gave colonial groups the legal fuel to demand their own freedom. But many European powers were reluctant to let go, seeing their colonies as strategic bulwarks against the spread of communism. This occurred in different ways, peacefully through armed resistance and through nationalist leaders. In places like India, the Indian National Congress successfully campaigned for independence through largely nonviolent means. In other spots, empires didn't go quietly. Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam or Algeria's National Liberation Front, where local armed resistance led to years of armed conflict. In Indonesia, Sukarno and the rise of nationalism was another example of indigenous groups reclaiming their political trajectory. While empires were shrinking abroad, European nations were trying something radical at home, actually getting along. To prevent another world war, states began setting aside nationalist rivalries in favor of economic and political integration. Think of the European Union like a group project that just kept growing. It started small with European coal and steel community. It evolved into the European economic community or common market, and finally became the European Union we know today. So what, you might ask? Well, the EU tried to create a shared European identity. And the big milestone starts with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, which officially formed the Union. And then in 1999, they introduced a common currency called the euro. The EU has not been without its challenges. The integration isn't always smooth. Member nations have had to balance their own national sovereignty with union responsibilities. Look at the European Parliament, the rules for free movement across borders, and the biggest challenge of all, Britain's Brexit in 2020, where a nation decided that the group project just wasn't for them anymore. Don't overlook the social changes that were happening, because by the late 20th century, the social fabric of Europe was being rewoven. For example, feminism. Thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir, author of The Second Sex, sparked second wave feminism, leading to birth control pills, the scientific means of fertilization, and women reaching high political offices like Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of England in the 1980s, Mary Robinson, the President of Ireland in the 90s, and Edith Cresson, who was Prime Minister of France in the early 90s. Europe became more diverse as migrant workers from Southern Europe, Asia, and Africa arrived to help the economy grow. This also led to the rise of anti-immigrant parties like the French National Front and the Austrian Freedom Party. But nations set aside rivalries for the European Union, introducing the euro, the European Parliament, and free movement across the borders. Though, as I mentioned before, challenges like Brexit show that national sovereignty remains a hot topic. Our final segment today looks at how we live today. Technology like the telephone, radio, television, computer, cell phones, and internet, they've all shrunk the world. But this progress has brought moral questions about abortion, fertility treatments, and genetic engineering. To really nail these cultural topics for the exam, you have to think of them as a massive breakup with the past. After the trauma of total war and economic depression, the old ways of seeing the world just didn't make sense anymore. Artists and writers moved away from trying to show objective reality and started exploring messy, subjective world of the human mind. Now, for visual arts, AP Euro kids, you know you need to know art. We go from Cubism to Futurism to Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism, and Pop art. These movements kicked things off by radically shifting aesthetic standards. Cubism broke objects into geometric parts, while Futurism celebrated the speed and technology of the new industrial age. Surrealism was this dream state of art, exploring the subconscious and subjective states to find meaning beyond the physical world. Abstract Expressionism and pop art following World War II, the influence of the US on popular culture skyrocketed. Abstract Expressionism focused on raw emotion, while pop art satirized Western consumer culture by using everyday objects as high art. Think Andy Warhol in Campbell's Soup Can. Architecture and music followed the same path, ditching traditional beauty for industrial efficiency and psychological depth. The Bauhaus movement and modernism emphasize that form follows function, creating a new architectural standard that favored clean lines and industrial materials. Stravinsky and Schoenberg, these composers radically shifted what people thought music should sound like. Igor Stravinsky used jarring rhythms, while Arnold Schoenberg developed atonality, which is music without a traditional key, tone, like without tone, exploring those same subjective states that were being found in visual arts. And post-war writers were the ultimate skeptics. They challenged traditional literary conventions and asked the big, uncomfortable questions about Western society. Existentialism and postmodernism, the horrors of the world wars undermined confidence in science and human reason, giving rise to these movements. The absurdity of life. Writers like Franz Kafka and Jean-Paul Sartre argued that objective meaning did not exist and that life could feel tragic or absurd, much like the myth of Sisyphus rolling a boulder uphill forever. And stream of consciousness. Authors like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf questioned Western values by diving into the internal, often chaotic thoughts of their characters, rather than following a traditional logical plot. If you see multiple choice questions about 20th century culture, look for words like subjectivity, experimentation, and disillusionment. These artists weren't just being weird for the sake of it. They were responding to a world that had been turned upside down by 2 world wars. The age of empire is gone, replaced by a globalized, interconnected, and sometimes uncertain European identity. Now, in the past 7 years, Unit 9 has shown up as an LEQ option 3 times, but never as a DBQ. The DBQ can cover up to the year 2001, so it's entirely possible that it might show up. I teased at the very beginning that I'm going to have a social media post about this very soon. Blind reacting or blind ranking what I think is going to be the DBQ topic. So be sure to follow me to see that. Now, don't forget, I am going live on TikTok on Sunday, April 26th at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time for our final review sprint. Bring any questions that you have, and we will get ready for you getting that 5 on your AP exam. Don't worry if you can't join us. Be sure that you have subscribed to the podcast, and you'll be notified when the next episode is released, which will be the recording of the live stream. If you have any questions that you would like answered, send them to me in advance. Just email me at wendy@aphistoryhelp.com. And with that, this episode of the AP History Help podcast is now history.